Hello, hello, all those beautiful faces. Welcome to part two of, I had it open, A Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. Well, that's actually all three of them right here. So, last night, if you were on here, I was specifically doing something about Memorial Day weekend and why we celebrate Memorial Day weekend, and we went into the history of it and how it connected to Frederick Douglass, and then we started reading Frederick Douglass. His first autobiography, and we read the preface and we read chapter one. And so, if you missed that, go ahead. The link is down in the description below. You can go back and catch up with us, or you can just hop in where we are. We're going to pick up on chapter two. And, if you've been here with us so far, you have been here for the quite vivid descriptions of the brutality of slavery. And that was just chapter one. In the preface, it was alluded to by both of the people, so the Wendell Phillips and William Lloyd Garrison, both alluded to the vivid articulations of this brutality and how it's such an important element of the abolitionist movement for informing people who might have this buffer between them and the realities of slavery and be able to tell themselves some other story about it or pretend it's not as bad as it is. But what Frederick Douglass does, right? He says right in the title, he was an American slave, a slave himself, in his own words, so clear and powerfully, really demonstrates how it was. So, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get right into chapter two of The Narrative of Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. So, my master's family consisted of two sons, Andrew and Richard, one daughter, Lucretia, and her husband, Captain Thomas Owl. They lived in one house upon the home plantation of Colonel Edward Lloyd. My master was Colonel Lloyd Clark. Colonel Lloyd's clerk and superintendent. He was what might be called the overseer of overseers. I spent 2 years of childhood on this plantation in my old master's family. It was here that I witnessed the bloody transaction recorded in the first chapter, and I received my first impression of slavery on this plantation. I will give some description of it and as slavery and of slavery as it existed there. The plantation is about 12 miles north of Easton in Talbot County, which happens to be where I am right now, oddly enough, and is situated on the border of Miles River. The principal products raised upon it were tobacco, corn, and wheat. These were raised in great abundance, so that with the products of this and other farms belonging to him, he was able to keep in almost constant employment a large sloop in carrying them to market at Baltimore. This sloop was named Sally Lloyd, in honor of one of the colonel's daughters. My master's son-in-law, Captain Auld, was the master of the vessel. She was otherwise manned by the colonel's own slaves. Their names were Peter, Isaac, Rich, and Jake. They were esteemed very highly by the other slaves and looked upon as privileged ones of the plantation, for it was no small affair in the eyes of a slave to be allowed to see Baltimore. Colonel Lloyd kept from 300 or 400 slaves on his home plantation and owned a large number more on the neighboring farms belonging to him. The names of the farms nearest to the home plantation were Y Town and New Design. Y Town was under the overseership of a man named Noah Willis. New Design was under the overseer of Mr. Townsend. The overseer of these and all the rest of the farms, numbering over 20, received advice and direction from the managers of the home plantation. This was the great business place. It was the seat of government for the whole 20 farms. All disputes among the overseers were settled here. If a slave was convicted of any high misdemeanor, became unmanageable, or evinced a determination to run away, he was brought immediately here, severely whipped, and put on board the sloop, carried to Baltimore, and sold to Austin Woolfolk or some other slave trader as a warning to slaves remaining. And so again, you can see we're getting into some of that very vivid imagery of the harsh realities of what it's like to deal in men, to treat some men in property as property. And I really think that I'm not sure necessarily what the age appropriate level is, maybe 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, but certainly before graduating from high school, if we want to teach true American history, right? Real American history, the good, the bad, the ugly. Frederick Douglass, reading this book, not just studying his life, but reading this book ought to be required reading material. All right, let's keep going. All right, here too, the slaves of all the other farms received their monthly allowance of food and their yearly clothing. The men and women slaves received their monthly allowance of food, 8 pounds of pork, or its equivalent in fish, and 1 bushel of cornmeal. Their yearly clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts, 1 pair of linen trousers like the shirts, 1 jacket, 1 pair of trousers for winter, made of coarse Negro cloth, 1 pair of stockings, and 1 pair of shoes, the whole of which could not have cost more than $7. The allowance of the slave children was given to their mothers or the old women having the care of them. The children unable to work in the field had neither shoes, stockings, jackets, nor trousers given to them. Their clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts per year. When these failed them, they went naked until the next allowance day. Children from 7 to 10 years old of both sexes, almost naked, might be seen of all seasons of the year. There were no beds given to the slaves unless 1 coarse blanket be considered such, and none but the men and women had these. This, however, is not considered a very great privation. They find less difficulty from the want of beds than from the want of time to sleep. For when their day's work in the field is done, the most of them, having their washing, mending, and cooking to do, have few or none of the ordinary facilities to do either of these. Very many of their sleeping hours are consumed in preparing for the field of the coming day. And when this is done, old and young, male and female, married and single, drop down side by side on one common bed, the cold, damp floor, each covering himself or herself with their miserable blankets, and full of meaning to themselves. I have sometimes thought that mere hearing of those songs would do more to impress the minds with the horrible character of slavery than the reading of the whole volumes of philosophy on the subject could do. I did not, when a slave, understand the deep meaning of those rude and apparently incoherent songs. I was myself within the circle, so that I neither saw nor heard those what without might see and hear. They told a tale of woe which was then altogether beyond my feeble comprehension. They were tones loud, long, and deep. They breathed the prayer and complaint of souls boiling over with the bitterish anguish. Every tone was a testimony against slavery and a prayer to God for the deliverance from chains. The hearing of those wild notes always depressed my spirit and filled me with ineffable sadness. I frequently found myself in tears while hearing them. The mere recurrence to those songs even now afflicts me. And while I'm writing these lines, an expression of the feeling has already found its way into my cheek. To those songs I trace my first glimmering conception of dehumanizing character of slavery. I can never get rid of that conception. Those songs still follow me to deepen my hatred of slavery and quicken my sympathies for my brethren in bonds. If anyone wishes to be impressed with the soul-killing effects of slavery, let him go to Colonel Lloyd's plantation and on allowance day place himself in the deep pine woods, and there let him in silence analyze the sounds that shall pass through the chambers of his soul. And if he is not thus impressed, it will only be because there is no flesh in his abundance heart. There is no flesh in his abudorate heart. Sorry, it's like split between 2 lines. Some of those are hard to read. Thanks, guys, for checking in. Appreciate you. Darth, as always. Make sure you hit that like button. You know, all that good YouTube stuff for me, of course. The songs of the slave represent the sorrows of his heart. I'm sorry, let's see, yes. And he is relieved by them only as an aching heart is relieved by its tears. At least such is my experience. I have often sung to drown my sorrow, but seldom to express my happiness. Crying for joy and singing for joy were alike uncommon to me while in the jaws of slavery. The singing of a man cast away upon desolate island might be as appropriately considered as evidence of contentment and happiness as the singing of a slave. The songs of one and of the other are prompted by the same emotion. It's all contextual, right? Can't really sing a happy song if you're stranded on an island or chains of slavery. All right, here we are, chapter 3. Colonel Lloyd kept a large and finely cultivated garden which afforded almost constant employment for 4 men, beside the chief gardener, Mr. M. Dermond. This garden was probably the greatest attraction of the place. During the summer months, people came from far and near, from Baltimore, Easton, and Annapolis to see it. It abounded in the fruits of almost every description, from hardly the apple of the North to the delicate orange of the South. This garden was not the least source of trouble on the plantation. Its excellent fruit was quite the temptation to the hungry swarms of boys as well as the older slaves belonging to the colonel, few of whom had the virtue or vice to resist it. Scarcely a day passed during the summer but that some slave had to take the lash for stealing fruit. The colonel had to resort to all kinds of stratagems to keep his slaves out of the garden, the last and most successful of which was tarring the fence all around. After which, if a slave was caught with any tar upon his person, it was deemed sufficient proof he had either been in the garden or had tried to get in. In either case, he was severely whipped by the chief gardener. This plan worked well. The slaves became as fearful of tar as of the lash. They seemed to realize the impossibility of touching tar without being defiled. The colonel also kept a splendid riding equipage. His stable and carriage house presented the appearance of some of our large city livery establishments. His horses of the finest form and noblest blood. His carriage house contained 3 splendid coaches, 3 or 4 gigs, beside Dearborn and barouches of the most fashionable style. Not really sure what all of those things are. I guess something to do with putting together your horse and carriage. The establishment was under care of 2 slaves, old Barney and young Barney, father and son. To attend this establishment was their sole work, but it was by no means an easy employment, for in nothing was Colonel Lloyd more particular than in the management of his horses. The slightest inattention to these was unpardonable, and was visited upon those under whose care they were placed with the severest punishment. No excuse could shield them if Colonel only suspected any want of attention to his horses, a supposition which he frequently indulged, and one which, of course, made the offense of old and young Barney a very trying one. They never knew when they were safe from punishment. They were frequently whipped when least deserving, and escaped whipping when most deserving it. Everything depended upon the looks of the horses and the state of Colonel Lloyd's own minds when his horses were brought to him for use. If a horse did not move fast enough or hold his head high enough, it was owing to some fault of his keepers. It was painful to stand near the stable door and hear the various complaints against the keepers when a horse was taken out for use. The horse has not had proper attention. He has not been sufficiently rubbed or curried, or he has not been properly fed. His food was too wet or too dry, or he got it too soon or too late. He was too hot or too cold. He had too much hay or not enough of the grain. He had too much grain. He had not enough hay. Instead of old Barney's attending to the horse, he had very improperly left it to his son. To all of these complaints, no matter how unjust, the slave must answer never a word. Colonel Lloyd could not brook any contradiction from a slave. When he spoke, a slave must stand, listen, and tremble, which such literally was the case. I have seen Colonel Lloyd make old Barney a man between 50 and 60 years of age, uncover his bald head, kneel down upon the cold, damp ground, and receive upon his naked, toil-worn shoulders more than 30 lashes at a time. Colonel Lloyd had 3 sons, Edward, Murray, and Daniel, and all 3 son-in-laws, Mr. Winder, Mr. Nicholson, and Mr. Lowndes. All these at the great house farm, and he enjoyed the luxury of whipping the servants when they pleased, from old Barney down to William Wilkes, the coach driver. I have seen Winder make one of the house servants stand off from him suitable distance to be touched with the end of the whip, and every stroke raise great ridges upon his back. To describe the wealth of Colonel Lloyd would be almost equal to describing the riches of Job. He kept from 10 to 15 house servants. He was said to own 1,000 slaves, and I think this estimate quite within the truth. Colonel Lloyd owned so many that he did not know them when he saw them, nor did all the slaves out of the farm know him. It is reported of him that while riding along the road one day, he met a colored man and addressed him in the usual manner of speaking to colored people in the public highways of the South. "Well, boy, whom to you do you belong?" "To Colonel Lloyd," replied the slave. "Well, does the colonel treat you well?" "No, sir," was the ready reply. "What, does he work you too hard?" "Yes, sir." "Well, he don't give you enough to eat?" "Yes, sir, he gives me enough, such as it is." The colonel, after ascertaining where the slave belonged, rode on. The man went on about his business, not dreaming that he had been conversing with his master. He thought, said, and heard nothing more of the matter until 2 or 3 weeks afterward. The poor man was then informed by his overseer that having found fault with his master, he was now to be sold to a Georgia trader. He was immediately chained and handcuffed, and thus, without a moment's warning, he was snatched away and forever sundered from his family and friends in a hand more unrelenting than death. This is the penalty of telling the truth, of telling a simple truth, and the answers in in a series of plain questions. It is particularly in consequence of such facts that slaves, when inquired as of their conditions and the character of their masters, almost universally say they are contented, and that their masters are kind. The slaveholder have been known to send spies among their slaves to ascertain their views and feelings in regard to their condition. The frequency of this has had the effect to establish among the slaves the maxim that a still tongue makes a wise head. They suppress the truth rather than take the consequences of telling it, and in doing so prove themselves a part of the human family. If they have anything to say of their masters, it is generally in their master's favor, especially when speaking to an untired man. I have been frequently asked when a slave if I have a kind master, and do not remember ever to have given a negative answer. Nor do I, in pursuing this course, uh, consider myself as uttering what was absolutely false, for I always measured the kindness of my master by the standard of kindness set upon the slaveholders around us. Moreover, slaves are like other people and imbibe prejudice quite common to others. They think their own better than that of others. Many, under the influence of this prejudice, think their own masters are better than the masters of other slaves, and this too in some cases when the very reverse is true. Indeed, it is not common for a slave to even fall out and quarrel among themselves about the relative goodness of their masters, each contending for the superior goodness of his own over the others. At the very same time, they mutually execrate their masters when viewed separately. It was so on our plantation. When Colonel Lloyd's slaves met the slaves of Jacob Jepson, they seldom parted without a quarrel about their masters. Colonel Lloyd's slaves contending that he was the richest, and Mr. Jepson's slaves that he was the smartest and the most of a man. Colonel Lloyd's slaves would boast his ability to buy and sell Jacob Jepson. Mr. Jepson's slaves would boast his ability to whip Colonel Lloyd's. These quarrels would almost always end in a fight between these parties, and that those whipped were supposed to have gained the point at issue. They seemed to think that the greatness of their masters was transferable to themselves. It was considered as being bad enough to be a slave, but to be a poor man's slave was deemed a disgrace indeed. So that's the end of chapter 3. And, the descriptions are startling. And it is interesting, of course, this form of slavery isn't happening, but for sure you can definitely see some of the echoes through the inequalities that we have, and how we get stuck in our own echo chambers fighting among ourselves and don't necessarily see the bigger picture of who we really should be directing our anger towards. So, chapter 4. Mr. Hopkins remained but in a short time in the office overseer. Why his career was so short, I do not know, but I suppose he lacked the necessary severity to suit Colonel Lloyd. Mr. Hopkins was succeeded by Mr. Austin Gore, a man possessing an eminent degree in all those traits and character indispensable to what was called a first-rate overseer. Mr. Gore had served Colonel Lloyd in the capacity of overseer upon one of the out farms, and had shown himself worthy of the high station of overseer upon the home or great house farm. Mr. Gore was proud, ambitious, and persevering. He was artful, cruel, and obdurate. He was he was just the man for such a place, and he was in just the place for such a man. It afforded scope for the full exercise of all his powers, and he seemed to be perfectly at home in it. He was one of those who could torture the slightest look, word, or gesture on the part of a slave into impudence, and would treat it accordingly. There must be no answering him back, no explanation that was allowed to a slave showing himself to have been wrongfully accused. Mr. Gore acted fully up to the maximum laid down by slaveholders. It is better that a dozen slaves suffer under the lash than that the overseer should be convicted in the presence of the slaves of having been at fault. No matter how innocent a slave might be, it availed him nothing when accused by Mr. Gore of any misdemeanor. To be accused was to be convicted, and to be convicted was to be punished, the one always following the other with immutable certainty. To escape punishment was to escape accusation, and a few slaves had the fortune to do either. Under the overseer of Mr. Gore, he was proud enough to demand the most debasing homage of the slave, and quite servile enough to crouch himself at the feet of the master. He was ambitious enough to be contented with nothing short of the highest rank of overseers, and persevering enough to reach the highest of his ambition. He was cruel enough to inflict the severest punishment, artful enough to descend to the lowest trickery, and obdurate enough to be insensible to the voice of a reproving conscience. He was, of all the overseers, the most dreaded by the slaves. His presence was painful. His eyes flashed confusion. His eye flashed confusion. He seldom was his sharp, shrill voice heard without producing horror and trembling in their ranks. Mr. Gore was a grave man, and though a young man, he indulged in no jokes and said no funny words, seldom smiled. His words were in perfect keeping with his looks, and his looks were in perfect keeping with his words. Overseers sometimes indulge in witty word, even with the slaves. Not so with Mr. Gore. He spoke but to command, and commanded but to be obeyed. He dealt sparingly with words, and bountifully with his whip, never using the former where the latter would answer as well. When he whipped, he seemed to do so uh, from a sense of duty, and feared no consequences. He did nothing reluctantly, no matter how disagreeable, always at his post, never inconsistent. He promised but to fulfill. He was, in a word, a man of the most inflexible firmness and stone-like coolness. His savage barbarity was equaled only by the consummate coolness with which he committed the grossest and most savage deeds upon slaves under his charge. Mr. Gore once undertook the whip of Mr. Colonel Lloyd's slaves by the name of Demby. He had given Demby but a few stripes when, to get rid of the scourging, he ran and plunged himself into a creek, and stood there at the depth of his shoulders, refusing to come out. Mr. Gore told him that he would give him 3 calls and that if he did not come out at the end of the 3rd call, he would shoot him. The first call was given. Demby made no response but stood his ground. The second and the third calls were given with the same result. Mr. Gore then, without consultation or deliberation with anyone, not even giving Demby an additional call, raised the musket to his face, taking deadly aim at his victim, at his standing victim, and in an instant poor Demby was no more. His mangled body sank out of sight, and blood and brains marked the water where he had stood. A thrill of horror flashed through everyone's soul in the plantation, excepting Mr. Gore. He alone seemed cool and collected. He was asked by Colonel Lloyd and my old master why he resorted to such extraordinary expedient, to this extraordinary expedient. His reply was, as well as I can remember, that Demby had become unmanageable. He was setting a dangerous example to the other slaves, of which, if suffered to pass without some demonstration on his part, would finally lead to the total subversion of all rule and order upon the plantation. He argued that if one slave refused to be corrected and escaped with his life, the other slaves would soon copy the example, the result of which would be the freedom of the slaves and the enslavement of whites. Mr. Gore's deference was satisfactory. He continued, and his stations need some water. So he was continued in his station as overseer upon the home plantation. His fame as an overseer went abroad. His horrid crime was not even submitted to judicial investigation. It was committed in the presence of slaves, and they, of course, could neither institute a suit nor testify against him, and thus the guilty perpetrator of one of the bloodiest and most foul murders goes unwhipped of justice and uncensored by the community in which he lives. Mr. Gore lived in St. Michael's, Talbot County. I was just there, yesterday or 2 days ago. Talbot County, Maryland, when I left there. And if he's still alive, he probably still lives there now. And if so, he is now, as he was then, a highly esteemed and much respected, as though his guilty soul had not been stained with his brother's blood. I speak advisedly when I say this, that killing a slave or any colored person in Talbot County, Maryland is not treated as a crime either by the courts or by the community. Mr. Thomas Landman of St. Michael's killed 2 slaves, one of whom he killed with a hatchet by knocking out his brains. He used to boast of the commission in an awful and bloody deed. I have heard him do so laughingly, saying among other things that he was the only benefactor of this country in of his country in the company, and that when others would do as much as he had done, we should be relieved of all these damned Negroes. My wife, the wife of Mr. Giles Hick, living but a short distance from where I used to live, murdered my wife's cousin, a young girl between 15 and 16 years of age, mangling her person in the most horrible manner, breaking her nose and breastbone with a stick, so that the poor girl expired in a few hours afterwards. She was immediately buried, but had not been in her untimely grave but a few hours before she was taken up and examined by the coroner, who decided that she had come to her death by severe beating. The offense for which the girl was thus murdered was this: she had been set that night to mind Mrs. Hick's baby, and during the night she fell asleep and the baby cried. She, having lost rest for several nights previous, did not hear the baby crying. They were both in the room when with Mrs. Hicks. Mrs. Hicks, finding the girl slow to move, jumped from her bed, seized an oak stick of wood by the fireplace, and with it broke the girl's nose and breastbone, and thus ended her life. I will not say that this most horrid murder produced no sensation in the community. It did produce sensation, but not enough to bring the murderess to punishment. There was a warrant issued for her arrest, but it was never served. Thus she escaped not only punishment, but even the pain of being arraigned before a court for her horrid crime. Whilst I'm detailing bloody deeds in which took place during my stay in Colonel Lloyd's plantation, I will briefly narrate another, which occurred about the same time as the murder of Denby by Mr. Gore. Colonel Lloyd's slaves were in the habit of spending a part of their nights on Sundays in fishing for oysters, and in this way made up for the deficiency of their scant allowance. An old man belonging to Colonel Lloyd, while thus engaged, happened to get beyond the limits of Colonel Lloyd's and on the premises of Mr. Beale Bonley. At this trespass Mr. Bonley took offense, and with his musket came down to the shore and blew his deadly contents into the poor old man. Mr. Bonley came over to see Colonel Lloyd the next day, whether to pay him for his property or to justify himself in what he had done, I know not. At any rate, the whole fiendish transaction was soon hushed up. There was very little said about it at all, and nothing done. It was a common saying, even among little white boys, that it was worth a half-cent to kill a nigger and a half-cent to bury one. All right, we'll keep going. All right, it's been 30 minutes. We're up to chapter 5. So I had said we'll go to chapter 6, but we'll see. I'm going to go for a full hour. So, as to my own treatment while I lived on Colonel Lloyd's plantation, it was very familiar to that of the other slave children. I was not old enough to work in the field, and there being little else to do than field work, I had a great deal of leisure time. Though the most I had to do was to drive up the cows at the evening, keep the fowls out of the garden, keep the front yard clean, and run the errands for my old master's daughter, Mrs. Lucretta Auld. The most of my leisure time I spent helping Master Daniel Lloyd and finding his birds after he shot them. My connection with Master Daniel was one of some advantage to me. He became quite attached to me, and he was sort of a protector of me. He would not allow the older boys to impose upon me, and would divide his cakes with me. I was seldom whipped by my master, and suffered little from anything else than hunger and cold. I suffered much from hunger, but much more from cold. In the hottest summer and the coldest winter, I was kept almost naked, no shoes, no stockings, no jacket, no trousers, nothing on but a coarse towel linen shirt, reaching only to my knees. I had no bed. I must have perished with cold, but that the coldest nights I used to steal a bag which was used for carrying corn to the mill. I would crawl into the bag, and there I would sleep on the cold, damp clay floor with my head and my feet out. My feet would have been so cracked with the frost that the pen with which I'm writing might have been laid in the gashes. We were not regularly allowanced. Our food was coarse cornmeal boiled. It was called mush. It was put into a large wooden tray or trough and set down on the ground. The children were then called like so many pigs, and like so many pigs they would come and devour the mush. Some with oyster shells, other with pieces of shingles, some with naked hands, and none with spoons. He that ate fastest got the most. He that was strongest secured the best place, and few left the trough satisfied. I was probably between 7 and 8 years old when I left Colonel Lloyd's plantation. I left it with joy. I shall never forget the ecstasy with which I received the intelligence that my old master Anthony had determined to let me go to Baltimore to live with Mr. Hugh Auld, brother to my old master's son-in-law, Captain Thomas Auld. I received this information about 3 days before my departure. They were 3 of the happiest days I ever enjoyed. I spent the most part of all these 3 days in the creek washing off the plantation scurf and preparing myself for my departure. The pride of appearance which this would indicate was not my own. I spent the time in washing not so much because I wished to, but because Miss Lucretia had told me I must get all the dead skin off my feet and knees before I could go to Baltimore. For the people in Baltimore were very, very clean, and would laugh at me if I looked dirty. Besides, she was going to give me a pair of trousers which I should not put on unless I got all the dirt off me. The thought of owning a pair of trousers was great indeed, right? The thought of owning a pair of trousers was great indeed. It was almost a sufficient motive not only to make me take off what would be called the pig drovers, pig drovers, the mange, but the skin itself. I went at it in good earnest, working for the first time with the hope of reward, right? So talking about some of those economic concepts of self-interest, being rewarded for your work, creating value. The ties that ordinarily bind children to their homes were all suspended in my case. I found no severe trial in my departure. My home was charmless. It was not a home to me. On parting from it, I could not feel that I was leaving anything from which I had enjoyed by staying. My mother was dead. My grandmother lived far off, so that I seldom saw her. I had 2 sisters and 1 brother that lived in the same house with me, but the early separation of us from our mother had nigh blotted the fact of our relationship from our memories. I looked for home elsewhere, and was confident of finding none which I should relish less than the one which I was leaving. If, however, I found in my new home hardship, hunger, whipping, and nakedness, I had the consolation that I should not have escaped any one of them by staying, having already the more than a taste of them in my house and in my old master, and having endured them there, I very naturally inferred my ability to endure them elsewhere, and especially at Baltimore, for I had something of a feeling about Baltimore that expressed in the proverb that being hanged in England is preferable to dying a natural death in Ireland. I had the strongest desire to see Baltimore. Cousin Tom, though not fluent in speech, had inspired me with the desire by his eloquent description of the place. I could never point out anything at the great house, no matter how beautiful or powerful, but that he had seen something at Baltimore far exceeding both in beauty and strength the object which I pointed out to him. Even the great house itself, with all its pictures, was inferior to the many buildings in Baltimore. So strong was my desire, the thought and gratification of it would fully compensate for whatever loss of comforts I should sustain by the exchange. I left without a regret and with the highest hopes of the future. We sailed out of Miles River for Baltimore on Saturday morning. I remember only the day of the week, for at that time I had no knowledge of the days of the month nor the months of the year. On setting sail, I walked aft, which is back, and gave to Colonel Lloyd's plantation what I hoped would be the last look. I then placed myself on the bow of the sloop, and there spent the remainder of the day in looking ahead, interesting myself with what was in the distance rather than things nearby or behind. In the afternoon of that day, we reached Annapolis, the capital of the state. We stopped but for a few moments, so that I had no time to go on shore. It was the first large town I had ever seen, and though it would look small compared to some of our New England factory villages, I thought it was a wonderful place for its size, more imposing even than the great house farm. We arrived at Baltimore early on Sunday morning, landing at Smith's Wharf, not far from Bowley's Wharf. We had on board the sloop a large flock of sheep, and after aiding in driving them to the slaughterhouse of Mr. Curtis on Loudon Slater's Hill, I was conducted by Rich, one of the hands belonging on board of the sloop, to my new home in Elysiana Street, near Mr. Gardner's shipyard on Fells Point. Mr. and Mrs. Alds were both at home, and met me at the door with their little son Thomas, to take care of whom I had been given. And here I saw what I had never seen before. It was a white face beaming with the most kindly emotions. It was the face of my new mistress, Sophia Auld. I wish I could describe the rapture that flashed through my soul as I beheld it. It was a new and strange sight to me, brightening up my pathway in the light of happiness. Little Thomas was told there he was, Freddie, and I was told to take care of little Thomas, and thus I entered upon the duties of my new home with the most cheering prospect ahead. I looked upon my departure from Colonel Lloyd's plantation as one of the most interesting events of my life. It is possible and even quite probable that but for this mere circumstance of being removed from that plantation to Baltimore, I should have to this day, instead of being here seated at my own table, in the enjoyment of freedom and the happiness of my home, writing this narrative, been confined in the galling chains of slavery. Fate. Going to live at Baltimore laid the foundation and opened the gateway to all my subsequent prosperities. I have ever regarded it as the first plain manifestation of a kind of providence which had ever since attended me and marked my life with so many favors. I regarded the selection of myself as being somewhat remarkable. There were a number of slave children that might have been sent from the plantation to Baltimore. Those who were younger, those who were older, those who were the same age. I was chosen among all of them and was the first, last, and only choice. I may be deemed superstitious and even egotistical, even regarding this event as special imposition of divine providence in my favor. But I should be false to the earliest sentiment of my soul if I suppress the opinion. I prefer to be true to myself, even at the hazard of incurring the ridicule of others, rather than to be false and incur my own abhorrence. From my earliest recollection, I date to the entertainment of a deep conviction that slavery would not always be able to hold me within its foul embrace. And in the darkest hours of my career in slavery, this living word of faith and spirit of hope departed not from me, but remained like a ministering angel to cheer me on through the gloom. This good spirit was from God, and to him I offer thanksgiving and praise. Amen to that. All right, chapter 6. My new mistress proved to be all she appeared to be when I first met her at the door, a woman of the kindest heart and finest feelings. She had never had a slave under her control previous to myself, and prior to her marriage she had been dependent upon her own industry for a living. She was by trade a weaver, and by constant application to her business she had been in a good degree preserved from the blighting and dehumanizing effects of slavery. I was utterly astonished at her goodness. I scarcely knew how to behave toward her. She was entirely unlike any other white woman I had ever seen. I could not approach her as I was accustomed to approach other white ladies. My earliest instruction was out of place. The crouching servility usually so acceptable a quality a slave did not answer when manifested toward her. Her favor was not gained by it. She seemed to be disturbed by it. She did not deem it impudent or unmannerly for a slave to look at her in the face. The meanest slave was put fully at ease in her presence, and none left without feeling better for having seen her. Her face was made of heavenly smiles, her voice of tranquil music. But alas, this kind heart had but a short time remained such. The fatal poison of irresponsible power was already in her hands and soon commenced its infernal work. That cheerful eye, under the influence of slavery, soon became red with rage. The voice that made all sweet accord changed to one of harsh and horrid discord, and that angelic face gave place to that of a demon. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she was very kindly commenced to teaching me the ABC. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning how to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. To use his own words further, he said, "If you give a nigger an inch, he will take it an ell. A nigger should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. Now," he said, "if you teach that nigger," speaking of myself, myself being speaking to Frederick Douglass, "how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy." These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new special revelation, a specially dark and mysterious thing with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me the most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man's. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was just what I wanted and what I got at the time when I least expected it. Whilst I was saddened by the thought of losing the aid of my kind mistress, I was gladdened by the invaluable instruction by which, by the most merest accident, I had gained from my master. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and fixed purpose, at whatever cost of trouble, to learn how to read. The very decided manner with which he spoke and strove to impress his wife with the evil consequences of giving me the instruction served to convince me he was deeply sensible of the truths he was uttering. It gave me the best assurance that I might rely with the utmost confidence on the results which he had said would flow from teaching me to read. What he most dreaded, what I most desired, what he most loved, what that I most hated, that which to him was a great evil to be carefully shunned, was to me a great good to be diligently sought. And the argument which he so warmly argued against my learning to read only served to inspire me with a desire and determination to learn. In learning to read, I owe almost as much to the bitter opposition of my master as to the kindly aid of my mistress. I acknowledge the benefit of both. Right? Got to learn to read. I had resided but a short time in Baltimore before I observed the marked difference in treatment of slaves from that which I had witnessed in the country. A city slave is almost a free man compared to a slave on the plantation. He is far better fed and clothed and enjoys privileges altogether unknown to the slave on the plantation. There is a vestige of decency, a sense of shame that does not much curb and check those outbreaks of atrocious cruelty so commonly enacted upon the plantation. He is a desperate slaveholder who will shock the humanity out of non-slaving, he is a desperate slaveholder who will shock the humanity of his non-slaveholding neighbors with the cries of his lacerated slave. Few are willing to incur the odium attached to the reputation of being a cruel master. And above all things, they would not be known as not giving a slave enough to eat. Every city slaveholder is anxious to have it known of him that he feeds his slaves well. And it is due to them to say that most of them do give their slaves enough to eat. There are, however, some painful exceptions to this rule. Directly opposite to us, Philpott Street, lived Mr. Thomas Hamilton. He owned two slaves. Their names were Henrietta and Mary. Henrietta was about 22 years of age and Mary about 14. And of all the mangled and emaciated creatures I ever looked upon, these two the most so. His heart must be harder than stone that could look upon these unmoved. The head, neck, the shoulders of Mary were literally cut to pieces. I frequently felt her head and found it nearly covered with festering sores caused by the lashes of her cruel mistress. I do not know that her master ever whipped her, but I have seen an eyewitness to the cruelty of Mrs. Hamilton. I used to be in Mr. Hamilton's house nearly every day. Mrs. Hamilton used to sit in a large chair in the middle of the room with a heavy cowskin always by her side, and scarce an hour passed during the day but was marked by the blood of one of these slaves. The girls seldom passed by her without saying, "Move faster, you black gyp," at the same time giving them a blow with the cowskin over the head or shoulders, often drawing blood. She would then say, "Take that, you black gyp," continuing, "If you don't move faster, I'll move you," added to the cruel lashings to which these slaves were subjected. They were kept nearly half starved. They seldom knew what it was to eat a full meal. I've seen Mary contending with the pigs for I've seen Mary contending with the pigs for the offal thrown into the street. So much as Mary kicked and cut to pieces, she was often called pecked than by her name. All right, so we're up to chapter 7. Let's see. So I think we'll read chapter 7 and then call it a night. Appreciate everybody who's been coming through. I lived in Master Hugh's family about 7 years. During this time, I succeeded in learning to read and write. In accomplishing this, I was compelled to resort to various stratagems. I had no regular teacher. My mistress, who had kindly commenced to instruct me, had, in compliance with the advice and direction of her husband, not only ceased to instruct me, but had set her face against my being instructed by anyone else. It is due, however, to my mistress to say that she did not adopt this course of treatment immediately. She at first lacked the depravity indispensable to shutting me up in a mental darkness. It was at least necessary for her to have some training in the exercise of irresponsible power to make her equal to the task of treating me as though I were a brute. My mistress was, if I had said, a kind, tender-hearted woman, and the simplicity of her soul she commenced, when I first went to live with her, to treat me as she supposed one human being ought to treat another. In entertaining upon the duties of a slaveholder, she did not seem to perceive that I sustained to her the relation of a mere chattel, and for her to the treatment of a human being was not only wrong but dangerously so. Slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me. When I went there, she was pious, warm, tender-hearted woman. There was no sorrow or suffering for which she had not a tear. She had bread for the hungry, clothes for the naked, comfort for every mourner that came within her reach. Slavery soon proved its ability to divest her of these heavenly qualities. Under its influence, the tender heart became stone, and the lamb-like disposition gave way to one of tiger-like fierceness. The first step in her downward course was her ceasing to instruct me. She now commenced to practice her husband's precepts. She finally became even more violent in her opposition than her husband himself. She was not satisfied with simply doing as well as he had commanded. She seemed anxious to do better. Nothing seemed to make her more angry than to see me with a newspaper. She seemed to think that here lay the danger. I have had her rush at me with a face made up of fury, and snatch from me the newspaper in a manner that fully reflected her apprehension. She was an apt woman, and little experience soon demonstrated to her satisfaction that education and slavery were incompatible with each other. From this time I was most narrowly watched. If I was in a separate room any considerable length of time, I was sure to be suspected of having a book and was at once called to give an account of myself. All this, however, was too late. The first step had been taken. Mistress, in teaching me the alphabet, had given me the inch, and no precaution could prevent me from taking the L. The plan which I adopted and the one by which I was most successful was that of making friends of little white boys when I met them in the street. As many of these as I could, I converted into teachers. With their kindly aid, obtained at many different times in many different places, I finally succeeded in learning to read. When I was sent of errands, I always took a book with me, and by going one part of my errand quickly, I found time to get a lesson before my return. I used to carry bread with me, enough of which always was in the house and which I was always welcome, for I was much better off in this regard than many of the poor white children in the neighborhood. This bread I used to bestow upon the hungry little urchins, who in return would give me that more valuable bread of knowledge. I am strongly tempted to give the names of 2 or 3 of those little boys as a testimony of the gratitude and affection I bear them. But prudence forbids. Not that it would injure me, but it might embarrass them. For it is almost unpardonable offense to teach slaves to read in this Christian country. It is enough to say of little dear fellows that they be lived on Philpott Street, very near Durgin and Bailey shipyard. I used to talk this matter of slavery over with them. I would sometimes say to them, I wish I could be as free as they would be when they got to be men. You will be free as soon as you're 21, but I am a slave for life. Have not I as good right to be as free as you have? These words used to be troublesome to them. They would express for me the liveliest sympathy and console me with the hope that something would occur by which I might be free. I was now about 12 years old, and the thought of being a slave for life began to bear heavily upon my heart. Just about that time, I got a hold of a book entitled The Columbian Orator. Every opportunity I got, I used to read this book. Among much of other interesting matter, I found in it dialogue between a master and his slave. The slave was represented as having run away from his master 3 times. The dialogue represented the conversation which took place between them when the slave was taken the 3rd time. In this dialogue, the whole argument on behalf of slavery was brought forward by the master, all of which was disposed of by the slave. The slave was made to say some very the slave was made to say some very smart as well as impressive things in reply to his master, things which he had desired things which had this desired though unexpected effect. For the conversation resulted in the voluntary emancipation of the slave on the part of the master. In the same book, I met with one of the Sheridan's mighty speeches on the behalf of the Catholic emancipation. These were choice documents to me. I read them over and over again with unabated interest. They gave tongue to interesting thoughts of my own soul, and which frequently had flashed through my mind and died away for want of utterance. The moral which I gained from the dialogue was the power of truth over conscience of the slaveholder. What I got from Sheridan was a bold denunciation of slavery and a powerful vindication of human rights. The reading of these documents enabled me to utter my thoughts and to meet those arguments brought forward to sustain slavery. But while they relieved me of one difficulty, they brought on another even more powerful than the one of which I was relieved. The more I read, the more I was led to abhor and detest my enslavers. I could regard them in no other light than the band of successful robbers who had left their homes and gone to Africa and stolen us from our homes and in a strange land reduced us to slavery. I loathed them as being the meanest as well as the most wicked men. I had read and contemplated the subject Behold, that very discontented which Master Hugh had predicted would follow my learning to read had already come to torment and sting my soul as unutterable anguish. As I withered under it, as I writhed under it, I would times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without the remedy. I opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but no ladder upon which to get out. In moments of agony, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. I have often wished myself a beast. I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to my own. Anything, no matter what, to get rid of thinking. It was this everlasting thinking of my condition that tormented me. There was no getting rid of it. It was pressed upon me by the object within sight or hearing, animate or inanimate. The silver trump of freedom had roused my soul to eternal wakefulness. Freedom now appeared to disappear no more forever. It was heard in every sound and seen in everything, was ever present to torment me with a sense of my wretched condition. I saw nothing without seeing it. I heard nothing without hearing it. I felt nothing without feeling it. It looked from every star. It smiled from every calm breath. Breathed in every wind and moved in every storm. I often found myself regretting my own existence and wishing myself dead. And but for the hope of being free, I had no doubt but that I should have killed myself or done something for which I should have been killed. While this state of mind, I was eager to hear anyone speak of slavery. I was a ready listener. Every little while, I could hear something about abolitionists. It was some time before I found out what the word meant. It was used in connections as to make it an interesting word to me. If a slave ran away and succeeded in getting clear, if a slave killed his master, set fire to a barn, or did anything very wrong in the mind of a slaveholder, it was spoken as the fruit of abolition. Hearing the word in connection very often, I set about learning what it meant. The dictionary afforded me little or no help. I found it was an act of abolishing, but then I did not know what was to be abolished. Here I was perplexed. I did not dare to ask anyone about its meaning, for I was satisfied that it was something they wanted me to know very little about. After a patient waiting, I got one of our city papers containing an account of the number of petitions from the North praying for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia and the slave trade between the states. From this time, I understood the words abolition and abolitionist, and always drew near when the words were spoken, expecting to hear something of importance to myself and fellow slaves. The wharf The light broke in upon me in my degrees. I went one day down on the wharf of Mr. Waters, and seeing two Irishmen unloading the scow of a stone, I went unasked and asked them to help. When we had finished, one of them came up to me and asked if I were a slave. I told him I was. He asked, "Are you a slave for life?" I told him that I was. The good Irishman seemed to be deeply affected by the statement. He said that other than it was a pity so fine a little fellow so myself should be a slave for life. He said it was a shame to hold me. They both advised me to run away to the north, that I should find friends there, and that I should be free. I pretended not to be interested in what they said, and treated them as if I did not understand them, for I feared they might be treacherous. White men have been known to encourage slaves to escape and then get the reward, catch them, or return them to their masters. I was afraid that these seemingly good men might use me so, but I nevertheless remember their advice. From time to time, I resolved to run away. I looked forward to that time at which I would be safe for me to escape. I was too young to think of doing so immediately. Besides, I wished to learn how to write, so I might occasion to write my own pass. I consoled myself with the hope that I should one day find a good soul. I consoled myself with the hope that I should one day find a good chance. Meanwhile, I would learn to write. The idea as how I might learn to write was suggested to me by being in Durgin and Bailey Whip shipyard and frequently seeing the ship carpenters, after hewing and getting just a piece of timber ready for use, write on the timber the name of the part of the ship for which it was intended. With a piece of timber, was intended for the larboard side, it would be marked thus L. When it was intended for the starboard side, it would be marked thus S. A piece for the larboard side forward would be marked thus LF. When a piece starboard side forward, would be marked SF. For the labor aft, it would be marked LA. For the starboard aft, it would be marked SA. I soon learned these names of these letters and for what they were intended when they were placed upon the timber in the ship. I immediately commenced copying them, and in a short time I was able to make the 4 letters named. After that, when I met with any boy I knew could write, I would tell him I could write as well as he. The next word would be, I don't believe you. Let me see you try it. I would make the letters which I had been so fortunate to learn and ask him to beat that. In this way, I got good as at many letters. I got good many lessons in writing, which it is possible I should never have gotten in any other way. During this time, my copying books was the board, fence, brick wall, and pavement. My pen and ink was a lump of chalk. With these, I learned mainly how to write. I then commenced and continued copying the italics in Webster's spelling book until I could make them all without looking on the book. By this time, my little master Thomas had gone to school and learned how to read and write and had written a number of copybooks. These had been brought home and shown to some of our neighbors and then laid aside. My mistress used to go to class meetings at the Wilkes Street meeting house every Monday afternoon and leave me to take care of the house. When left thus, I used to spend time in writing the spaces left in Mr. Thomas's copybook, copying what he had written. I continued to do this until I could handwrite a hand very similar to that of Mr. Thomas. Thus, after a long, tedious effort for years, I finally succeeded in learning how to write. And so we'll stop there at the end of chapter 7. Definitely an intense story, but so inspiring, right? Hearing the thing that he shouldn't do and why he shouldn't do it. I mean, Mr. Auld was essentially admitting that Black people and white people have the same capabilities, which is why we have to keep them down and not allow them to learn. And he picked up on that and he said, that's exactly what I'm going to learn to do. And he went out and found the way, didn't make excuses, couldn't make excuses. And I think we need a little bit more of that American attitude today, looking within ourselves and saying, what can I do with what I have? All of us are in a better off position than Frederick Douglass was. And somehow he figured it out. And I believe that we can too. So this is, as we're remembering Memorial Day this weekend or whatever time of the year that you are watching this back, these are the concepts and the values that I believe that we fight to protect in this country. Not what our government is doing, not what our elected officials are even doing necessarily, since they don't really represent us a lot of the times. But it's these values and these concepts that Frederick Douglass encompasses in his life, and I hope to encompass a little bit more in my life. And I appreciate you, Darth, hanging out. I hope that you are as a big a fan of Frederick Douglass as I am, I can definitely count myself a fangirl of Frederick Douglass. Pretty handsome looking guy, actually, if I had to say. Got that nice part thing going on right there. And appreciate you guys all. Have a wonderful night. God bless. And we're gonna keep going with this. We're about halfway through, so it's gonna probably take us another 2 sittings. So we'll do tomorrow night and another night next week. So I love all your beautiful faces. Keep thinking free. Keep living free. And keep teaching liberty. Right? Make sure you share this stream out. Tell your friends to come hang out and nerd out with some Frederick Douglass.